A 7-year-old boy vanished without a trace during a family vacation at a historic mountain lodge. No witnesses, no clues, no goodbye. But 27 years later, when a hotel maid opens a sealed maintenance closet, everything changes horrifyingly, heartbreakingly so. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a pale gray sky, dusting the pine-lined road as Daniel Carter steered the SUV up the final winding stretch toward Alder Peak Lodge. The tires crunched softly over packed snow, the only sound beneath the soft strains of classical music playing on the car stereo. Beside him in the passenger seat, Margaret sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring out at the mountain landscape but seeing none of it. In the back seat, 7-year-old Leo chattered excitedly to himself, pointing out icicles hanging from tree limbs and the distant shapes of deer moving through the frost-covered forest. "Did you see that one?" he asked, eyes wide behind his fogged-up glasses. "It had antlers like a crown." Daniel forced a smile. "I saw, buddy. That was a buck." Margaret offered no response. Alder Peak Lodge appeared around the final bend, like something from a storybook, an enormous timber-framed retreat nestled against the base of snow-capped cliffs. Smoke curled from multiple stone chimneys, and strings of warm golden lights twinkled under the eaves, giving the place a glow that seemed to promise comfort and peace. It had been Daniel's idea, this vacation. 3 nights away from the noise of the city, the work stress, the silences that had grown heavier between him and Margaret over the past year. He had found the lodge online, advertised as a historic winter sanctuary with roaring fireplaces, guided snowshoe treks, and an award-winning chef. And, crucially, no cell service. "We're here!" Leo squealed as Daniel pulled into the circular driveway. A doorman in a thick wool coat stepped forward to greet them, brushing snow off the windshield with a broom while Daniel climbed out. "Welcome to Alder Peak, Mr. Carter," the man said, smiling politely. "We've been expecting you." Daniel helped Leo out of the car as Margaret exited slowly, adjusting her scarf and surveying the lodge with wary eyes. Inside, the lobby was a vision of rustic, charm-towering ceilings held up by wooden beams, a crackling fire in the hearth, and the scent of cedar and cinnamon in the air. Leo ran ahead to examine a mounted elk head on the far wall. Margaret didn't follow. Daniel turned toward her, his voice low. "Let's just try, for Leo's sake." Margaret didn't answer. She merely nodded and followed the bellhop toward the elevator, the distance between them growing in the dim golden light. Neither of them saw Leo pause by the far hallway, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on a corridor marked, "Renovation, do not enter." The door there stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond oddly inviting. The snow had thickened outside, falling in a silent curtain beyond the lodge's frosted windows. But inside Alder Peak, everything glowed. Warm light spilled from antique sconces onto velvet rugs and gleaming wood floors, casting the long hallways in a golden haze. Leo Carter padded softly through the upper level, fingers grazing the wall as he went. He had already lost interest in the welcome packet and the hot chocolate offered in the lobby. What captivated him now were the echoes. Every footstep produced a faint, whispering response from the walls, as though the lodge itself were listening. He imagined the place breathing, the same way his mother did when she meditated slow and steady, in through the nose and out through the mouth. The hotel, he decided, was very much alive. He rounded a corner and found himself in a corridor unlike the others. It was dimmer, colder, and smelled faintly of something earthy, like wet stone and dust. A velvet rope stretched across the entrance with a faded sign, "Under renovation, staff only." But the rope sagged on one side, and the door just beyond hung slightly open, as if waiting. Leo looked over his shoulder, but the hallway was empty. No guests, no staff, no parents. He ducked under the rope. The air changed immediately. It felt heavier, as though the space beyond hadn't been touched in years. The carpet here was a darker red, the wallpaper peeling at the edges. A row of doors lined the corridor, each one closed except for the last, which was cracked open just enough to show slivers of shadow. Leo tiptoed forward, his small shoes making no sound. Inside that open room, he saw remnants of a forgotten Timean iron bed frame without a mattress, a dust-covered vanity, a cracked mirror still clinging to the wall. A single child's shoe sat in the corner as though dropped in haste. He moved closer, then stopped. A low creaking came from overhead, like someone walking in the attic above him. He tilted his head upward, listening. Another soft creak followed, then nothing. A draft brushed the back of his neck. He turned around, half expecting someone to be standing there. No one. Still, he smiled. Leo loved hotels. He loved the mysteries in the wallpaper, the smell of old books and furniture polish, the way one hallway could lead to somewhere secret. He didn't feel scaredly curious. The lodge, he thought, was full of stories, and maybe one of them was waiting just for him. Quietly, he stepped deeper inside. The snow fell harder that afternoon, turning the world outside Alder Peak Lodge into a quiet, colorless dream. Thick flakes clung to the windows, and the wind whistled low through the eaves like a voice trying to be heard but never quite forming words. Inside, the Carter family tried their best to pretend it was just another day. Margaret was reading by the fireplace in the grand lounge, though she hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. Daniel sat nearby, nursing a drink he hadn't sipped in some time. And Leah, restless, bright, always in motion, had grown bored with the puzzles and hot cocoa, with the polite smiles from passing staff, with the thin attempts at normalcy his parents offered like strained smiles at a funeral. "Let's play hide and seek," he said, standing suddenly in the middle of the lounge. "Please, just one round. I'll be really fast." Daniel looked up. "Leo, not too far, okay? Just this floor." "I promise," Leo said with a grin. "You count." Before either parent could object, he darted out of the room, his small footsteps disappearing into the hush of the lodge. Daniel sighed and leaned his head back against the couch. 10-9. Margaret closed her book. "He needs this," she murmured, but her voice was uncertain. Outside, the wind shifted, colder now. Somewhere in the upper halls, Leo giggled as he ran, his breath coming out in visible puffs. He bypassed the elevators and instead took the old stairwell, the one with the squeaky fifth step and the chipped railing. He'd remembered it from earlier explorations. The storm was picking up, but that only made it more exciting. Everything felt muffled and magical, as if the world had folded in on itself just for him. He reached the back exit near the laundry rooms. It had a small courtyard beyond it, a place they used for staff deliveries, now blanketed in white. He pressed the crash bar and slipped outside, snow instantly latching onto his coat and hair. His boots crunched lightly then, more lightly, until they made no sound at all. 10 minutes later, Daniel and Margaret called out his name down every hallway, their voices echoing with rising panic. They found the door to the courtyard open. Snow had blown in, scattering across the threshold. Beyond that, only an untouched blanket of white stretched out under a darkening sky. No footsteps. No drag marks, no Leo. Just snow, falling and falling, erasing everything. The lodge erupted into motion within the hour. At first, Daniel and Margaret's shouts had sounded like the ordinary calls of parents searching for a curious child who'd wandered too far. A boy distracted by snow or a forgotten hallway. But by the time staff had swept the guest floors twice, and Margaret was screaming Leo's name through the front lobby with a tremor in her voice that made other guests stand still, the weight of it all began to shift. It wasn't just worry anymore, it was fear, cold and sudden and undeniable. Night had fallen fast, the snowstorm, already heavy, had grown merciless, visibility outside was near zero. Inside the lodge, the fireplaces still burned. The lights still glowed soft and golden, but the warmth had left the building. People whispered. A mother tucked her child closer in the lounge. An elderly man at the bar stopped mid-sip, listening to the frantic footfalls on the stairs. The hotel manager, pale and sweating beneath his polished professionalism, ordered a full lockdown. No one in, no one out. Guests gathered in the great hall, murmuring prayers or clutching their coats. Staff swept every hallway, opened every utility closet, checked the attic crawlspaces and boiler rooms, shouting his name into the dark. Daniel refused to stop moving. He raced from floor to floor, calling until his voice cracked, certain Leo was just one turn, one hallway away. Police arrived just after 8 p.m., their lights flashing red against the snowblind windows. A canine unit followed soon after. Margaret, wrapped in a blanket and rocking silently by the hearth, could only manage to whisper, "He was just here, he was just playing." The dogs caught his scent almost immediately, faint but unmistakable. They followed it down the east hall, up the main stairwell, toward the back of the second floor. The trail turned sharply and stopped. Dead. Right in front of a roped-off corridor labeled, "Renovation, no access." Beyond that point, nothing. The dogs pawed at the carpet, confused. They whined. One of them sat, ears low. Detectives reviewed the hotel's security footage. There were 12 cameras covering the property. 11 worked fine. The 12th, mounted just outside that renovation wing, had gone dark between 4:17 and 6:03 p.m. The exact window when Leo vanished. The footage before the failure showed nothing but an empty hall. The next frame captured a snow-covered doorway swinging gently shut. The technician couldn't explain it. Nothing about the night made sense. Leo Carter had simply disappeared. The days bled into one another with the dull ache of repetition: search, question, hope, collapse. The snowstorm lifted 2 days after Leo vanished, but by then, the world inside Alder Peak Lodge had turned gray and numb. Police combed the forest with drones and volunteers. Dogs sniffed under cabins and porches. Divers broke ice on the nearby lake just in case. But the search yielded nothing. No trail, no sound, no ransom note. Just that same cruel silence. By the 5th day, the media had arrived. Cameras were stationed outside the lodge, bundled in scarves and boom mics, narrating the disappearance with concerned brows and dramatic pauses. A 7-year-old boy, gone without a trace. But the town didn't need the news to feel the loss. The staff whispered about Leo like he had been a ghost to begin with, and guests departed quietly, their vacations tainted by a grief too sharp to ignore. Inside room 206, Margaret Carter sat on the floor by the window, still wrapped in the same wool sweater from the day Leo disappeared. Her hair hung in unwashed waves, and her eyes no longer tracked movement when people entered the room. She had stopped speaking after the 3rd day, after the police officer said, "We're doing everything we can, ma'am," and left behind only an empty promise. Daniel had become someone else entirely. He slept in 30-minute stretches, if at all, waking with a jolt each time to scribble notes in the leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. He charted hallways, rewrote timelines, created diagrams of security footage angles. He questioned staff twice, sometimes 3 times, forgetting who had said what he already knew. He called the lead detective hourly. When calls stopped being answered, he showed up at the station. When they told him to rest, he snapped. "They're wasting time," he told Margaret, pacing their hotel room, eyes sunken and raw. "They think he's gone. They've already started moving on. But I know he's here. He never left this place." Margaret didn't reply. She hadn't for hours. By the end of the 2nd week, the police scaled back the search. The lodge reopened to new guests. The Carters were advised gently, with practice sympathido, return home. They did, but not together. The flight home was quiet. Margaret stared blankly out the window the entire time, Daniel hunched over his notes, red pen in hand. They never discussed it, never spoke the words, but something between them broke on that mountain. Grief took what was left and scattered it like ash. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if the old hotel was holding its breath. Elena Marquez moved through the 2nd-floor hallway with her cart, her steps muffled by the thick carpet and the years of habit. After nearly 2 decades at Alder Peak Lodge, she knew every creak in the floorboards, every stubborn doorknob, every window that refused to stay shut no matter how hard you latched it. The lodge had its moods, and this morning something about the air felt different, heavier. Renovation was coming. Management had announced it 2 weeks prior, a full restoration of the East Wing, finally updating the old rooms that hadn't been touched in decades. Elena had been assigned to start clearing out the unused areas, to dust and document anything worth salvaging before the contractors arrived. She didn't mind the work. If anything, she welcomed the solitude. She had just finished wiping down a window pane crusted with time when she saw IT door at the end of the corridor, slightly obscured by a leaning supply shelf and an old dusty floor lamp. She hadn't noticed it before. Above the handle, a faded sign hung crooked on a nail. Maintenance. Do not enter. The doorknob was bolted shut with a heavy latch, rusted at the hinges but clearly not meant for casual access. Elena hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. The hall remained still, only her cart stood witness. The key ring she'd been issued held dozens of keys. She tried them one by one until, with a reluctant click, the bolt slid open. The door groaned as it swung inward, the smell of stale air and dust rushing out like breath held too long. Inside was a small, narrow room, bare walls, a cracked concrete floor, no windows. It wasn't until she stepped inside that she realized it wasn't a maintenance room at all. At the far end stood a closet door, small, warped, and sealed shut with two rusted metal locks and a vertical bar fastened with screws. A child's toy lay nearby, a plastic dinosaur missing a leg, its surface faded and scratched. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong here. She reached for her radio, her voice suddenly shaky. "This is Elena, second floor east wing," she said. I think you need to send someone up." Her fingers hovered over the closet's handle, not yet touching it, not yet ready. The silence on the other side of the door felt too complete, too practiced, like something had been waiting there for a very long time. The screwdriver trembled slightly in Elena's hand as she wedged it beneath the rusted screws holding the metal bar in place. The hotel had sent a maintenance man to assist, but he'd shrugged at the sight of the sealed closet and muttered something about forgotten renovations. Then he left her with a toolbox and a nod of permission. "Call me if you find mold," he'd said, already walking away. But this wasn't mold. This wasn't anything as simple as water damage or bad wiring. This closet had been intentionally sealed, with two locks and a bar that looked welded from panic more than protocol. Elena didn't want to be the one opening it, not really, but some invisible thread tugged her forward, curiosity laced with unease, woven together in a quiet, persistent pull. The last screw fell free, with a reluctant squeal of metal. The bar clanged softly as she lowered it to the floor. The door, old and splintering, creaked open inch by inch, revealing the dark beyond. She coughed at the smell. It wasn't rot-knot quite, but oldness, like a forgotten cellar where things are left to become other things. Dust spiraled in the flashlight's beam as she stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The space was no larger than a walk-in pantry. The walls were bare concrete, stained with damp streaks. In the center of the floor lay a thin, dust-coated mattress, its corners curled inward like a dried leaf. On top of it sat a small winter coat, child-sized, puffy, the fabric cracked and stiff with age. A single mitten was tucked inside one sleeve. Beside the mattress, half buried in grime, was a toy dinosaur. Its green plastic skin was faded almost to gray. One leg snapped off at the joint. The eyes were painted on, but the left had long since worn away, leaving a blank space where something once looked back. Elena didn't move for a long time. Her flashlight trembled as she swept it slowly over the corners, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. But there was nothing else. No furniture. No windows. Just the coat, the toy, and the bed-like. Someone had tried to make the bare minimum version of a room a child could live in, or be kept in. She turned back to the open door, heart pounding, and picked up her radio again. "This wasn't maintenance," she said quietly. "You need to call the police." The police arrived just after noon, their presence disrupting the fragile stillness that had settled over the East Wing. Elena watched from the end of the hallway as two officers and a detective in a long coat moved past her cleaning cart, voices low, steps deliberate. One of them nodded politely at her before disappearing into the room at the far end, the one she had opened, the one she now wished she hadn't. She was allowed to stay nearby, though no one said why. Maybe they wanted her available in case they had questions, Or maybe it was because she was the one who had touched the door, had unfastened those rusted screws with shaking hands. She sat on a bench beneath a dusty window and stared at her hands, still lined with dirt she couldn't scrub off in the staff bathroom. Inside the closet, flashlights swept the space again and again. Evidence bags crackled. The child's coat was lifted carefully, turned over, its sleeves examined. The dinosaur, broken and fragile, was placed in a plastic container with gloved hands. The mattress was folded in on itself, revealing what little had been hidden beneath it: crumbs, lint, a small scrap of fabric that might once have been part of a blanket. But what drew the officer's full attention was the door itself. Detective Reyes knelt beside it, running her hand over the edge where the latch had been. There, embedded into the wood with rusted bolts, was a metal lock-on that wasn't part of the original construction. She looked closer, frowning. "It's mounted from the outside," she said aloud, turning toward the officer behind her. "The child couldn't have closed themselves in. Someone locked this, sealed it, intentionally." They all stood in silence for a moment. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again softly, steadily as if nothing had changed. But inside the lodge, something fundamental had shifted. Alder Peak's past had been waiting in that closet, pressed into dust and silence, and now it had surfaced like a body thawing from beneath the ice. Elena looked up as Detective Reyes stepped out of the room and approached her. The woman's eyes were kind, but tired, and held the weight of what she already knew. "Do you remember a missing child from this hotel?" the detective asked softly. Elena nodded. "Leo," she whispered. And suddenly, 27 years collapsed into a single, shivering moment of understanding. Detective Mara Reyes sat alone in the conference room, the case file spread before her like a wound reopened. The folder was thick, overstuffed, the corners softened by time and too many hands. A single name in black ink stood out on the cover. Leo Carter, missing person, 1998. She ran her fingers across it, as if touching the paper could somehow bring her closer to the boy who had vanished all those years ago. The room was quiet but not still. The old building creaked with age, and down the hall someone's phone buzzed insistently. But here, in this moment, Mara was back in her childhood home, sitting on the living room carpet, eavesdropping as her father, Officer Reyes, back then spoke in a low voice to her mother in the kitchen. 7 years old. Disappeared from a ski lodge. No prints, no leads. It's like he was erased. Her father had only been a rookie then, not even 30, but the case had haunted him. She remembered how it had changed, made him quieter, heavier. And now, it was hers. She flipped open the file. Black and white photocopies of Leo's school photo, a boy with crooked teeth and bright eyes behind round glasses. A timeline scrawled in early handwriting. Interview transcripts with shaken hotel staff and exhausted parents. The language in the reports shifted subtly over time from missing to presumed runaway to presumed deceased. The optimism eroded slowly, replaced with bureaucratic distance. But there were things that stood out now. Things that hadn't before. The security camera that failed, never repaired, never replaced. The mention of a door to a renovation wing left unlocked the morning after Leo vanished. An unnamed maintenance employee whose employment file was inexplicably thin. No last known address. Mara pulled a legal pad toward her and began jotting notes in tight, controlled handwriting. She didn't speak them aloud, but the questions hummed like static in her brain. Who locked that closet? Why that wing? Who had access to a latch that bolts from the outside? She closed the folder and sat back in her chair. Her father had passed away 2 years ago, but as she stared at the boy's face on the file cover, she felt the echo of his voice inside her. Don't give up too soon. Some doors take decades to open. Mara turned back to the file. The door had finally opened. Now, she would walk through it. Daniel Carter lived alone in a weather-worn cabin on the outskirts of Leadville, Colorado, not far from the lake where the police had once dragged the icy waters in search of his son. The structure was modest 2 rooms, a creaking porch, wood stacked neatly under the eaves. He kept to himself. He didn't own a television, didn't answer unknown numbers, and hadn't been into town in 3 months. The groceries he couldn't grow or trap himself were delivered to a drop box by the highway, paid in cash, and left without conversation. His world was small now, by choice. He didn't want the noise, he had lived too long with the sound of his own guilt. Inside the cabin, Leo's drawing still hung on the wall above the fireplace. One of the stick-figure astronaut floating among crooked stars was curling at the edges, the tape yellowed with age. Daniel lit the fire every morning, even in summer, just to hear something crackle and burn. It reminded him that time still moved, even if he didn't. 14 years had passed since he last saw Margaret. She lived 2 states away now, in Santa Fe. A gallery curator, married again. To a man who knew how to talk about wine and politics and never asked questions about photographs missing from the frames on her desk, in her new life, Leo did not exist. There were no pictures of him in the house, no boxes in the attic marked with his name. If someone mentioned a boy who had gone missing at Alder Peak Lodge, Margaret would tilt her head slightly and say, "I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that." But the forgetting was not real. It was a performance, rehearsed so thoroughly that even her therapist had started to believe it. She carried the weight in quieter ways, and the stiff way she made her bed every morning, the 2 tidy rows of shoes in her closet, the glass of wine she always poured but never finished. Her husband once found a single mitten at the back of a drawer and asked who it belonged to. She said it must have come with the house. They had not spoken since the 10th year after Leo's disappearance. When Daniel had mailed her a key he found in an old jacket, convinced it had belonged to someone at the hotel. She returned it in a padded envelope with a note that read, "Please stop." And so, they had. But grief doesn't disappear. It hardens into shape, settles in the body like sediment. Neither of them had buried a son, but both lived as if they had. Detective Reyes stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway outside the forensic lab, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the cold of the concrete floor seeping through the soles of her shoes. The phone call had come late the night before, the kind that jolted you upright before your brain was fully awake, the kind where the voice on the other end didn't waste time with greetings. "The results are back," the tech had said. "You're going to want to see this in person." Inside the lab, the lead forensic analyst, a middle-aged man with silver-framed glasses and nicotine-stained fingertips, pulled out a manila folder and opened it slowly, like the weight of it was something he could feel in his hands. He didn't look up at first, he just laid out the summary sheet, rotated it toward her, and let the numbers speak. Hair, blood, trace skin cells on the coat collar, all a match. Leo Carter. She sat down without realizing she'd moved. The hum of the lab's ventilation system suddenly filled her ears like static. After 27 years, the boy who had vanished without a trace had not left Alder Peak Lodge after all. He had been there, hidden, confined, forgotten. "How long?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. The forensic tech hesitated. "We're running deeper analysis, now environmental traces, dietary markers, that sort of thing. But initial estimates. The blood's age is consistent with a presence extending several years past the disappearance date. We're not talking days or weeks. Leo didn't just vanish, he lived in that closet." Mara felt a slow chill crawl up the back of her neck. The closet had been barely bigger than a pantry. No windows, no light, no access from inside, just a mattress, a coat, and a toy. "Do we know when he died?" she asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Too early to say definitively," the tech replied. "But there's evidence that he was alive well beyond 1998. Could have been years. The coat fibers and food traces we found suggest prolonged habitation." A sudden, breathless thought struck her. Someone had kept him there. Not stolen and vanished, as everyone assumed. Hidden, right beneath their feet, while his name faded from headlines and his parents fell apart and the world went on pretending he was gone. But he hadn't been. Not yet. The truth had been waiting in the walls, waiting for someone to come back and listen. Detective Reyes spent the next 2 days chasing ghosts in name tags. Most of the original staff from 1998 had long since scattered, retired, moved on, disappeared into quieter lives. A few had passed away. Some didn't return her calls. Others answered, but their memories were vague, dulled by time and repetition. "I remember the snow," one said. "Heard the parents screaming in the hall," said another. None could say anything she hadn't already read in the case files. They remembered the panic, the flashing lights of squad cars, the dogs sniffing at doorways. But no one remembered Leo. Not really. Not where he went. Except for one. Elias Kremer had been the hotel's maintenance man for over 30 years, and the last living person who'd worked in that East Wing during the winter of '98. Reyes found him tucked away in a nursing home on the outskirts of Boulder, in a small room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wool. He was nearly 90 now, skin like paper, eyes cloudy but sharp. When she mentioned Alder Peak Lodge, he turned his head slowly, as if her words had peeled back something he'd boarded up long ago. "Still standing, that place?" he asked, his voice a husky whisper. "I figured the mountain would have taken it back by now." She pulled a chair closer. "I'm investigating the Leo Carter case. You were on staff that winter." Kremer chuckled, though there was no amusement in it. "The boy who vanished without a footprint, that's what the papers called him, like he floated off into the snow." "Do you remember anything unusual?" Reyes asked gently. "About the maintenance closets, that wing, any renovations that were going on?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the window, where light was filtering through closed blinds in narrow golden stripes. "Sometimes," he said finally, "we're told to leave things alone." She leaned forward. "Told by who?" Kremer's lips twitched, forming a bitter smile. "Management, guests, the house itself maybe. You work somewhere long enough, you learn which doors you're not supposed to touch, and which ones you pretend you didn't see open." Reyes sat in silence for a beat, then asked, "Do you remember that closet?" He nodded. "Once, slowly. I was the one who installed the second latch," he said. "Didn't ask questions. Wasn't told much. Just got the order and the hardware." "Why?" she asked. Elias turned to her, his gaze steady now, unblinking. "Some doors," he murmured, "shouldn't be opened twice." The forensic team had already logged the contents of the closet, packed the coat, the mattress, and the toy dinosaur into evidence bags, and swept the walls for prints. But something about the space still nagged at Detective Reyes, feeling she couldn't name, only follow. She stood inside the tiny room again, now empty, the air heavier with meaning. The scent of mildew lingered. The floor had been scrubbed, but retained the quiet sadness of something lived in and abandoned. She pressed her palm flat against the wall, then ran it along the baseboard, checking for seams, for edges. It wasn't logical, not procedural, just instinct. It took 15 minutes before her fingers caught the lip of a panel near the floor, behind where the mattress had once been. It didn't look like a drawer, just a warped slat of wood discolored by age. She wedged a pen beneath the edge and lifted gently until it popped free. Inside was a shallow cubby, no bigger than a shoebox. Dust stirred as she reached in and pulled out a small spiral-bound notebook, the cover tattered and water-stained, its wire spine bent in places. A sticker of a rocket ship peeled from the front, faded to the point of abstraction. She opened it slowly. The first few pages were filled with childish drawing smiling suns, stick figures with wild hair, crooked trees under storm clouds. Then came the tally marks, dozens, hundreds. Some neatly drawn in rows, others scribbled wildly across margins. As the pages turned, the handwriting grew shakier, the crayon lines heavier. The figures in the drawings lost their smiles. Then came words. Short sentences. "It's too quiet when he goes." "I forgot my birthday." "I think I'm supposed to be asleep more than I am." "He doesn't call me Leo anymore." Reyes stopped there, her hand frozen mid-turn. She turned the next page. "He says I'm not Leo now. He says Leo is gone, and I'm lucky he found me in time." And then, The final entry. Written in a jagged graphite scrawl that dug into the paper, "He said I'm not Leo anymore." Reyes sat back on her heels, the notebook cradled in her hands like something sacred and broken. She imagined the boy sitting alone in this cramped space, holding this notebook, pressing his memories onto paper because there was no one else to remember him. Not Leo anymore. But still, unmistakably, him. The silence around her deepened. Detective Reyes sat cross-legged on the floor of Alder Peak's storage room, surrounded by cardboard boxes stacked like sediment layers of forgotten time. The room smelled of dry paper and mothballs, and every drawer she opened exhaled a breath of the past. Guest registries from the 90s had been stuffed into metal filing cabinets and then left to gather dust-uneven stacks of check-in slips, carbon copies of handwritten names, scrawled room assignments. Most of the logs from the week of Leo Carter's disappearance were intact. Most. Box after box, Reyes sorted through the records, checking for a familiar rhythm, the steady cadence of dates and names. But when she reached December 20th through the 26th of 1998, the pattern broke. Entire pages were missing. An entire guest ledger, labeled Wing C December, had been ripped from its binding, the jagged spine still holding a few stubborn paper threads. It hadn't been misplaced or misfiled. It had been removed. She leaned back on her hands, staring at the empty ring where that week's records should have lived. Her heart beat a little faster. After a few deep breaths, she turned to the digital archives the hotel had begun compiling in the early 2000s, scanned copies of handwritten entries meant to preserve guest history for marketing purposes. The data was inconsistent, but some entries had survived. She typed in names she'd already flagged: frequent guests, staff family members, random visitors. It was in one of the auxiliary spreadsheet shaft, corrupted, unfiltered, a raw data dump, that she saw it. Emmerich, Carl. Room 712. Checked in December 20th, 1998. Checked out, no record. Reyes stared at the name. It hadn't been on any of the physical logs, no photo ID on file, no credit card attached. She backtracked and found it again, 3 days earlier, under a different spelling: K. Emmerich. Same handwriting, same room number, same gap in checkout. She kept digging. In the following year's registry, he reappeared as Carl Emerton, then Kevin E., always checking into the same general part of the hotel, close to the east wing, close to the room above the closet. Whoever he was, he hadn't come and gone. He'd lived in the seams of the lodge, hidden in plain sight. And while the world searched the woods and the lake for Leo Carter, this man had been a hallway away, watching, waiting, changing names like costumes. Reyes closed the laptop and whispered the name aloud, as if trying it on her tongue. Carl Emmerich. She didn't know who he was yet, but she knew what he'd done. The email came just after midnight, buried beneath a pile of auto-responses and out-of-office replies. The subject line was plain: R.E., Alder Peak Inquiry. Detective Reyes nearly missed it, her eyes half closed and her coffee gone cold, but something about the sender's name stopped her. Jonas Brill. She clicked it open. Detective Reyes. My name is Jonas Brill. I worked at Alder Peak Lodge during the winter of 1998 as a bellhop. I'm currently living in Norway, but I saw the article about the reopened case online. I've tried to forget what happened that week, but after reading what you found in the closet, I think I need to tell you something. Please call me. Attached was a phone number with an Oslo area code. Reyes stared at the screen, the hum of her desk lamp the only sound in the room. She dialed. He answered on the second ring. Detective? His voice was quiet, older now, with a trace of an accent not native to Norway. Boston, maybe. Yes, Mr. Brill, thank you for responding. A long pause stretched across the line. She could hear him breathing, like he was gathering something hard to lift. I was just a kid back then, he said finally. 19, my first winter working at the lodge. I didn't even finish the season. Why not? Reyes asked gently. Because of what I saw, he said, and because someone told me to forget it. She waited. One afternoon it was snowing hard. I was delivering towels to the third-floor service closet. That's near the staff elevator, the one we weren't supposed to let guests use. I saw a man come around the corner with a boy, small, wearing a winter coat and dragging a stuffed animal. Rhea's chest tightened. Do you remember what the man looked like? White, mid-40s maybe, pale, wore those maintenance coveralls like the night staff. The boy looked nervous, kept glancing at me. What happened next? They got into the elevator. The man looked at me and said, Brill's voice wavered, softened. He said, "If you know what's good for you, kid, you didn't see anything." Did you tell anyone? I tried. My supervisor brushed it off, said it was probably someone's nephew visiting for the weekend. He paused. But I knew. That boy didn't belong to him. He didn't look back. Not once. Reyes wrote it all down. Heart hammering. A hallway. A boy. A warning. The silence that followed had lasted 27 years. But now, it was breaking. The file was thin, far too thin for someone who had lived and worked inside a hotel for over a year. Detective Reyes turned the manila folder over in her hands, her eyes scanning the single-page employment application inside. Carl Emmerich, handwritten in shaky block letters. No middle name. The address listed was a post office box in Glenwood Springs. No emergency contact. No prior work history. No social security number, just a scribbled note from a former manager. Hard worker, quiet, keeps to himself. It wasn't even signed. She frowned. Someone had either been very careless or very deliberate. Reyes cross-referenced the name through state employee databases and correctional records. What she found didn't surprise. It just made the knot in her chest tighten. Carl Emmerich had once worked as a janitor at Ravenhill Psychiatric Hospital, a now-defunct mental health facility 2 towns over, shuttered in the mid-90s after a series of abuse allegations and budget cuts. His time there lasted just under a year. A week after Ravenhill closed, he applied for work at Alder Peak. There was more. A sealed juvenile record out of Illinois. Reyes couldn't see the details, but the charge was labeled under unlawful restraint. He would have been 17 at the time. She petitioned for access. While she waited, she combed through local newspaper archives and found a small, unassuming article, "Runaway Teen Found Bound, in Basement of Abandoned Home Minor in Custody." No names, no photos. But the timing matched, the town matched, the silence afterward matched. Then came the part that pulled the air from the room. In a 1,999 staff memo filed months after Leo disappeared, Carl Emmerich's name was listed as no longer employed, no exit interview, no forwarding address, no final paycheck cashed. Just a short note. Emmerich left property without notice, locker cleared by staff. It was as if he'd vanished into the same thin air that had swallowed Leo. Reyes sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the faint, typewritten letters of his name. A man who had once locked someone in a basement had been left unsupervised in a hotel full of forgotten corridors and old closets. And while a child disappeared, he had simply walked away. She wasn't sure which part chilled her more, the crimes Carl Emmerich had committed, or the ease with which he'd been allowed to disappear. Room 713 had long been a question mark on the hotel's floor plan, never listed as available, never cleaned by staff, never included in guest tours or maintenance logs. When Detective Reyes asked the current general manager about it, he shrugged and said it had always been marked for long-term storage. No one had a key. No one had been inside in years. That changed with a bolt cutter and a quiet click. The door creaked open with the sound of old secrets exhaling. Reyes stepped inside, her flashlight beam catching motes of dust suspended in the still air like ash. The room was dim, even by Alder Peak standards. Heavy curtains blocked out the daylight, and the overhead bulb flickered once and died, as if protesting the intrusion. The smell hit her first, stale paper, something damp and chemical underneath it. The bed was still made, military tight, with a wool blanket folded at the foot. A small desk sat beneath the window, its surface cluttered with old magazines, broken pens, and yellowed notebooks stacked haphazardly. On the nightstand sat a lamp, a mug still half filled with what looked like fossilized coffee, and a plastic alarm clock frozen at 3:17. The walls were covered in photographs. Reyes stepped closer, her heart thudding as she took them in. Dozens of snapshots, most printed on cheap, curling photo paper, were tacked to the wood-paneled walls in overlapping layers. Some were in black and white, others in the oversaturated hues of disposable cameras. In nearly all of them, children. Some stood near playgrounds, others sat on park benches, stared out from behind diner windows, or walked beside adults whose faces had been carefully cut away. Many were grainy, taken from a distance. Some had been scribbled on, the names of locations or dates penned in a jagged hand, and a few were clearly taken inside the hotel. One in particular made her chest seize. Leo Carter, younger than the photo in the case file, maybe 6 years old, stood in what looked like the basement hallway of the East Wing. He was wearing the same winter coat they found in the closet. His eyes were wide, not smiling, not posing, looking at someone just outside the frame. Beside it, other children, unnamed, unclaimed, some looking directly into the lens. Reyes began to photograph the walls, cataloging everything, dread curling in her gut like smoke. Who were they? And how many had no one left to ask? The storage facility sat off a narrow frontage road just outside of Rifle, Colorado, its chain-link perimeter coated with wind-blown dust and years of indifference. Rows of corrugated steel doors stretched into the distance, each identical, each marked with peeling numbers. Detective Reyes stood beside Unit 42B, clipboard in hand, heart tightening as the manager unlocked the latch. "You're sure this was his?" she asked. The man nodded. Carl Emmerich. Rented it under his name until the payments stopped. Died in a car wreck off Highway 9. No next of kin. We held onto the unit longer than we were supposed to. Guy gave us no trouble, paid up front. But after a few years, he gestured to the rusting door. State never claimed it. No one did. Reyes signed the paperwork, her signature suddenly feeling like a final period on a sentence too long unfinished. The door groaned open, revealing a single overhead bulb that sputtered to life, casting pale light across a cramped, dust-choked space. It smelled like mothballs and mold, the air stale and unmoving. Boxes lined the floor in uneven stacks. Some were labeled in faint pencil: books, winter, tools. Others had no markings at all. She pulled on gloves and stepped inside. The first few boxes were mundane. Paperbacks with cracked spines, threadbare clothes folded with surprising neatness, an old toaster, a tangled heap of extension cords. But toward the back, buried beneath a torn tarp, she found the box that made her stop. Inside were notebooks, 5 of them, each bound in black faux leather, filled margin to margin in the same jagged handwriting she had seen on the back of the photographs in room 713. The pages were dense, rambling, a flood of thought that looped back on itself. Pages punctuated by names, some scratched out, others underlined. Leo is quiet now. He's mine again. The others didn't stay, but he did. At the bottom of the box was a VHS tape, unmarked, wound tightly in brittle black ribbon. She set it aside carefully, her gloved hand trembling. Underneath that, tucked in a plastic grocery bag, was a pair of red children's shoes, size 3, worn, untied. Reyes stood in the center of the unit and exhaled slowly. Carl Emmerich hadn't fled. He had remained hidden, tucked neatly into the folds of the ordinary. Just another name on a lease, just another face no one remembered. He was a man who learned how to disappear while standing still. The tapes were packed into an old shoebox wrapped in duct tape, the kind used for shipping or sealing things not meant to be opened. Detective Reyes peeled it back slowly, the adhesive fighting her fingers with a stickiness that seemed almost deliberate. Inside, a neat row of VHS tapes lined up spine to spine, each marked with black Sharpie, faded and smudged but legible. 1998 1999 Lansen. Lansenling E. She stopped at the first one. 1998. The year Leo vanished. The forensic team set up an old television and VCR in a quiet room at the precinct, the screen glowing to life with a soft blue flicker. Reyes sat forward in her chair, jaw tight, her eyes never leaving the screen. An evidence tech inserted the tape and pressed play. For a few seconds only static, then the image blinked into clarity. A dim room flickering light bulb overhead, bare concrete walls. The camera was handheld, unsteady. It tilted down to reveal a small boy sitting cross-legged on a thin mattress. He was wearing a winter coat, zipped up to his chin despite the indoor setting. His hair was longer than in the school photos, slightly matted on one side. His glasses had been removed. He looked directly into the lens. "Can I talk now?" he asked, voice small, hopeful. Someone off camera replied. The voice was low, gravelly, male. "Go ahead." Leo swallowed and looked back at the camera. "Too not sure what I'm supposed to say." "Just talk to Dad." Leo hesitated. Then, "Hi, Dad. I was good today. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't cry. I remembered the rules." Reyes's hands clenched in her lap. The tape rolled on, timestamp blinking in the corner. In another segment, Leo sat drawing on the floor, murmuring a tune under his breath. Occasionally, the camera would zoom in too close, too intimate in his hands, his face, the way his lips trembled while he tried to smile. Then, a different clip. Leo in the same room, curled under a blanket, whispering to himself. The audio barely picked up his words. "He said I'm lucky. He saved me. He said my mom didn't want me anymore." Reyes reached for the remote and paused the screen, Leo's face frozen mid-sentence. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the tape inside the machine, still spinning, still holding years of horror in magnetic coils. She knew there were more tapes, more years. And every one of them had to be watched. Detective Reyes found the page tucked between two others in Leo's journal, as if someone had tried to rip it out but couldn't quite bring themselves to finish the tear. The edge was frayed, a jagged crescent where paper had given way to panic. It was smeared faintly with something dark old ink, maybe, or something elsened, folded once, hastily. She opened it carefully, her gloves crackling against the brittle paper. The handwriting was Leo's. She'd memorized it by now. The shaky slant, the way he dotted his I's with tiny loops instead of dots, the uneven pressure that left some letters faint and others dug into the paper like wounds. "I was quiet for so long. I followed the rules. I stopped asking to leave. But I thought if I could just get to the hallway, someone would see me. He chased me. He was so fast. I didn't know where to go. I climbed up. I hid in the vents. I stayed still. My whole body hurt. I tried not to breathe. He found me anyway. He said I ruined everything." Reyes read the passage twice, then a third time, each word heavy as stone. She imagined the boy Leo crawling through the narrow metal ducts of the hotel, the cold seeping through his coat, hands raw against sharp aluminum edges. The vents weren't big. She'd seen them during the building walkthroughs. Barely wide enough for an adult arm, but a child might have fit. A desperate, starved child might have squeezed through. There had been rumors back then. One of the search dogs had barked near a vent panel. A theory floated that Leo had fallen in. Maintenance staff dismissed it as impossible. But the page said otherwise. He hadn't fallen. He'd run. And he'd almost made it. Reyes stared at the words. He said I ruined everything, the pen stroke heavier, shakier, as if Leo had written them in fear or shame, or both. The ink bled through the page. A boy trapped for years, and for one brief, breathless moment, he'd tried to break free. Climbed into the veins of the hotel itself, crawling through metal and shadow, chasing the hope of light, of air, of someone any who might notice. But hope, like everything else in that place, had been caught, silenced, buried. Until now. The sledgehammer struck the wall with a hollow crack, sending a puff of dust into the stale air. The construction crew had been called in to carefully dismantle the closet's far side panel that had always seemed oddly thick, as if the wall had been doubled up without purpose. Detective Reyes stood just outside the threshold, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the spreading crack in the plaster. Another swing! A groan of old wood. Then, silence. One of the workers stepped back, his face paling beneath the dust mask. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. Everyone in the room felt it. Something had shifted. The air had changed. The third blow broke through. Behind the plaster, behind the false wall, and the layer of insulation, was a small cavity. Reyes moved in slowly, her footsteps muffled against the worn floorboards. The flashlight in her hand cast a pale circle inside the void, and there, half buried in decades of dust and fibers, was what looked at first like cloth, fabric, a sleeve, then bone. The room fell utterly still. A medical examiner was called. Forensics arrived. The crew was ushered out in silence, hard hats clutched in nervous hands. Reyes remained by the doorway, unable to pull her eyes away from the dark recess. She didn't need a DNA report. She already knew. It was Leo. 3 hours later, the remains were removed in pieces carefully, reverently. The bones were small, fragile. Time had taken its toll, but what remained told a story more brutal than any report ever could. A partial skeleton, curled inward. Cloth fibers that matched the coat from the closet. Hair still tangled in the collar. A small button in the shape of a star. The forensic pathologist said the estimate was clear. The boy had lived at least 3, maybe 4 years after he vanished. 4 years. Reyes stared down at the evidence laid out in the temporary lab set up in the hotel's old dining room. Leo hadn't vanished into the woods. He hadn't been taken far away or sold off into the horrors the worst-case theories had offered. He had been here. In this room. In this wing. And when he died, however it had happened, he had been sealed into the walls like an unwanted secret, buried inside the very place that had promised warmth and safety to those who paid for a view of the mountains. A child, left behind a wall, forgotten. But not anymore. The room they used wasn't meant for moments like this. It was a windowless office at the edge of the police station, quiet and impersonal, with pale blue walls and a conference table that still bore faint coffee rings from meetings past. But it had been cleared for this, just for them. The lights were dimmed. A box waited in the center of the table, marked Recovered Personal Effects. Inside, the last fragments of a childhood that had vanished before it ever finished becoming one. Daniel arrived first. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, knees bouncing slightly, eyes fixed on the floor. His beard was longer now, streaked with gray. His clothes hung loose on his frame, as if he hadn't quite remembered how to dress for this kind of occasion. He didn't look up when the door opened again. Margaret stepped in, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her face drawn and colorless. She paused at the threshold, as if uncertain she could cross it, but she did. No words passed between them. Detective Reyes remained near the doorway, silent, respectful, a quiet presence anchoring the grief in the room. She opened the box and stepped back. Inside were carefully bagged items: the coat, the broken plastic dinosaur, a small dog-eared spiral notebook with graphite smudges along the edges. At the bottom, nestled between the folds of a yellowed sheet, was a single page, crayon on construction paper. A dinosaur green with jagged teeth walking beside a stick-figure child labeled Leo in unsteady uppercase letters. Above them, a bright yellow sun with too many rays beamed down over slanted hills. It had been folded in half, likely used as a bookmark. On the back, in small writing, "I want to go outside." Daniel reached for the drawing with a trembling hand. The moment he touched it, something broke. His breath hitched. A sound escaped, half sob, half exhale, and he bent forward, clutching the page like it was the last solid thing left in the world. His shoulders shook. Margaret remained frozen, staring down at the contents, her eyes welling but her body unmoving, as if the pain had calcified inside her. "I remember this," Daniel whispered. "He made this that night. He asked me if dinosaurs ever got cold." Margaret closed her eyes. And in that small, sterile room, two parents reunited not by hope, but by the unbearable weight of the truth. Leo had been found. And now, they could finally grieve. Detective Reyes had stared at the photo wall in room 713 more times than she could count. The faces had started haunting her, not just Leo's, but the others, the unnamed children, some blurred, some sharp, some captured mid-step as if unaware they were being watched. She had taken high-resolution scans of each one and sent them through every available missing persons database, national and state level, hoping, against all odds, that someone might recognize a face the world had forgotten. Days passed. Most yielded nothing. No matches, no families waiting. Just hollow echoes in the system. Then one morning, her inbox pinged. The email came from a case liaison in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Attached was a photograph. A boy, maybe 10, smiling in a baseball uniform, his mitt too big for his hand. The subject line read, Possible ID match. Missing child case. Y 7223. Reyes opened the attachment. Her heart dropped. It was the same boy, same jawline, same deep-set eyes frozen in one of Emmerich's photos, sitting at a diner booth, staring out the window. The photo had always unsettled her. Unlike the others, this boy wasn't looking at the camera. He looked away, like he knew something he wasn't supposed to, like he had already seen too much. His name had been Nathaniel Moore. Reported missing in the summer of 2002. Last seen riding his bike near his neighborhood just outside of Casper. No witnesses, no note, no trace. Just a bike later found behind a gas station, abandoned and mud-splattered. He had vanished into the long stretch of highway that wrapped around his town like a loose thread. He was never found. Reyes called the Cheyenne PD. Hours later, she had Nathaniel's full case file on her desk. There was no connection between his family and Alder Peak. No reason for him to have been anywhere near Colorado. But the photo in room 713 had been time-stamped crudely, on the back, in Emmerich's handwriting. August 2002. That was the same summer Leo's journal entries had gone silent. The same year he had stopped drawing. She didn't need to wonder why. Carl Emmerich had found another child. Reyes sat back in her chair, the hum of her computer, the only sound in the room. Her stomach turned. One victim had been overlooked for decades. Now there were two. And how many others had never been photographed? Leo hadn't been the end. He might have only been the beginning. The first headlines broke just after dawn. Remains of missing boy found in wall of Colorado Lodge. Hotel employee linked to multiple child disappearances. Alder Peak secrets, hidden room, unanswered crimes. By noon, the story had circled the globe. Satellite trucks parked along the winding mountain road, their wheels crunching the frost-crusted gravel just beyond the main gate. Reporters huddled in down jackets, speaking into cameras while snow drifted quietly around them. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing sweeping shots of the lodge's pitched roof and shuttered windows. There was no smoke from the chimneys now, no warm golden lights spilling from the eaves. Just the stark silhouette of Alder Peak, standing cold and still beneath a pale winter sky. The management issued a carefully worded statement. "We are cooperating fully with authorities. The safety and dignity of our guests has always been our top priority." No one believed it. Bookings were canceled en masse. Staff resigned overnight. By the end of the week, the lodge was closed indefinitely, its website reduced to a single placeholder page. Attorneys filed wrongful death suits on behalf of Leo Carter's family. Civil investigators announced an internal review. There were whispers of further charges, of negligence buried in decades of ignored red flags. But it wasn't just the press or the legal fallout. It was the guests. They started coming forward in waves, people who had stayed at the lodge over the years, especially those who'd slept in the East Wing or rooms near it. Their stories, once dismissed as the exaggerations of overactive imaginations, began to resurface with chilling clarity. A woman from Nebraska recalled her son, crying every night during their stay in 2001, insisting someone was whispering his name through the wall. A retired schoolteacher said her room key once stopped working 3 nights in a row, always at the same hour, 2:17 a.m. And when maintenance arrived, they found the lock inexplicably jammed from the inside. Another guest posted online about waking up to find her window open, the curtains fluttering in the dead of winter, though she had latched it tightly before bed. It felt like something had left the room, she wrote, but not through the door. Cold spots, unlocked closets, soft footsteps on tile when no one was awake. The lodge had always been charming, they said. Atmospheric, historic. Now it was something else entirely. A place that had been alive, not with stories, but with secrets. And some of them had never stopped moving. The wind rolled off the peaks in long, quiet gusts, carrying the scent of pine and ice through the clearing that overlooked Alder Valley. Snow blanketed everything in soft silence, the kind that muffled even the sound of breath. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low over the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the fresh white ground. A narrow trail of footprints marked the path to the memorial site, but no one spoke as they arrived. There was nothing left to say. A simple wooden bench had been placed beneath a cluster of aspens, just feet from where Leo's remains had been found. Beside it stood a small stone marker, carved with care. Leo Carter. 1991, 2002. Loved, found, remembered. The crowd was small, just those who had waited the longest. Margaret came with her husband, but stood a few feet apart, wrapped in a dark coat, her face unreadable. Daniel approached slowly, a modest urn clutched in both hands. He looked thinner, quieter than he had weeks before, but his movements were steady now, no longer driven by obsession, but something gentler. Acceptance, perhaps. Or at least the closest thing to it grief could offer. He stood in the center of the clearing and knelt. The wind picked up again as he opened the lid. Ashes spilled gently into the air and drifted down into the snow, a soft gray contrast against the white. Some caught in the breeze and rose, lifting toward the trees before disappearing into the light. Daniel whispered something, too quiet for the others to hear. Then he closed the urn and stepped back. Detective Reyes came forward last. In her gloved hand, she held the folded sheet of construction paper, edges worn, the dinosaur still vivid in its crayon green. Leo's name was printed at the top, large and proud. She crouched by the edge of the stone and brushed the snow aside, revealing a patch of dark soil. Carefully she pressed the drawing into the ground, anchoring it beneath a small, flat stone. Then she leaned close, her voice soft and steady. "You're not forgotten anymore." The wind quieted, the trees stood still. For the first time in 27 years, the mountain didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It felt like it was exhaling. Finally, gently. And beneath the aspens, where the snow caught the light just so, it almost looked like a boy had just passed through, smiling, heading home.